Hello, and welcome to Why Do We Do That, a psychology podcast that deconstructs human behavior from the perspectives of social scientists, psychologists, and others that use applied psychology in their work. I'm your host, Dr. Ryan Moyer. In this episode, I sat down with neuroscientist and author Dr. Joseph Jebelli. Joseph received his PhD in neuroscience from University College London for his work on the cell biology of neurodegenerative diseases. Joseph has published several books, including In Pursuit of Memory, The Fight Against Alzheimer's, How the Mind Changed, A Human History of Our Evolving Brain, and The Brain at Rest, Why Doing Nothing Can Change Your Life, which was the focus of our conversation. One of my main takeaways from my conversation with Joseph was the need to fundamentally reconsider how we define rest. Too often, rest is framed as idleness, doing nothing, being lazy, or stepping away from productivity altogether. Joseph challenges this assumption by emphasizing that rest is often an active process, one in which the brain continues its work quietly in the background, organizing, integrating, and consolidating information. This invisible labor not only supports recovery, but also enhances problem solving, fuels creativity, and sharpens focus when we return to demanding tasks. Another insight that stood out was how many of the activities we instinctively turn to for rest in modern life may actually erode its restorative potential. Endless scrolling or online gaming can offer brief distraction, but they rarely provide the conditions the brain needs to recover from constant stimulation. In contrast, activities like playful movement, walking in nature, or even something as simple as mind wandering can create the mental space necessary for true restoration, giving the brain a chance to reset, repair, and renew itself. If you're feeling overwhelmed by overwork or burnout, or find yourself often saying, "There's no time for rest," I encourage you to listen closely to Joseph's compelling case for why rest isn't a luxury, but a necessity. Enjoy. Okay, today I am joined by Joseph Jebelli. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Well, thank you for having me, Ryan.
Joseph has a new book out called The Brain at Rest, How the Art and Science of Doing Nothing Can Improve Your Life. I really enjoyed the book. One of my first thoughts was, how can you fill an entire book about doing nothing? And it really explored some very interesting avenues that I never thought of. It was a very complete story, I felt, around the topic of rest. So I'm really excited to talk to you about it. Let's start off with some background. What really called you to write a book about rest?
So there are a few reasons. To begin with, it was kind of personal. So my father, he overworked to the point of burnout and then ended up suffering from major depressive disorder as a result. My mother, her work ethic is even more extreme than my father's, and she now has blood pressure that's so high, her doctor contacts her almost every day asking for daily blood pressure readings. So I grew up seeing my parents work very, very hard, overwork, burnout, and just getting to the point where it really has severely affected their mental and physical health. And for me, myself as well, I started to experience the effects of overwork and burnout while I was working as a research scientist. So I would basically spend all day in the laboratory performing experiments, mentoring students, and then I would leave the lab and go straight to a coffee shop and work on grants and my first book until like 10 or 11 o'clock at night. And so, needless to say, it was really exhausting. And as a result, things like my sleep was affected, my creativity was affected. And I started to realize I couldn't sustain that pace indefinitely. So I started to ease off from work a little bit. I still worked hard, but I just eased off a bit. And I noticed when I did that that suddenly I was sleeping better and I was able to think more clearly and solve problems more effectively. And I thought, this is really, really interesting. As a neuroscientist, I was thinking, what's actually going on in the brain here? Because something quite profound is going on in the brain here now that I'm taking more time to rest.
Right.
And so I started to look into the neuroscience of rest as a result of that. And what I found was really, really extraordinary. And that's what led to me, yeah, deciding to write the book.
So, this idea of being overworked, it seems as though rest is like this super obvious solution to burnout at work, right? Like it just has this feeling of like, obviously you're working too hard. It's very clear, like when people are overworked, that they're just, burning the candle at both ends. Why do you think it's so difficult for people to acknowledge this fact?
I think there are two main reasons for that. I think it's a cultural problem and also a lack of scientific understanding problem. So the cultural problem, really, when you look at the history of work and rest, you can go all the way back to the 16th century Protestant work ethic of just keep calm, carry on, get on with it. The harder you work, the more you're going to achieve. You just need to buckle down and white knuckle it and work really, really hard. And when you combine that with what we've had in previous decades, which is what I basically call untrammeled capitalism, capitalism without enough regulations, essentially. Because if you think about it, it wasn't that long ago in human history that, um, that we were all working full time on the weekends. Like, the modern, weekend, 2 day break a week. That's a fairly modern invention. So there's been a cultural problem to it, but really it's all about a lack of scientific understanding because our understanding of work and rest is completely upside down. And the reason it's upside down is because we don't understand that rest, we don't see rest for what it really is for the brain. So when you speak to people about rest, they think of something that's a luxury, that's indulgent, a little bit irresponsible and unprincipled. Um, and they also think of rest, especially when you're disengaging from a task and you just go off and walk in the park or just sit on your sofa and stare into space. They think of the brain like a muscle. So they think of rest like you're powering down, essentially. Like your brain is powering down when you rest. When you quote unquote do nothing, you're powering down. Your brain is powering down. But that's the complete opposite of what's happening. If anything, the brain is powering up when we rest. And that's because when we rest, our brain activates what I talk about in great detail in the book, what we call the default network. And that's essentially a network of neurons that fans out across your brain. It actually occupies about 20% of the brain. And it's only active when you rest. And by rest, what I mean are, I don't mean staring at your phone, which is not rest. I mean things like staring out of the window and letting your mind wander, staring into space, going on a walk in a park, just sitting down and doing nothing. Because when you seemingly do nothing, your brain is doing a lot of something. And we now know this is the really interesting thing is that when you activate your default network with rest, you improve your creativity, your memory, your problem solving abilities, your emotional processing. It even lowers your chance of developing disorders like depression and dementia. And so, we've had this understanding of rest and work being in opposition with each other, but actually, rest is the driving force of work. It's the thing that gives you not only your greatest creative insights, it's the thing that helps you with your long-term productivity as well. So, as I say in the book, the really exciting thing about what this new neuroscience is showing us is that people actually succeed in life not despite their inactivity, but because of it. And so we need to take rest far more seriously than we currently are.
So you mentioned some examples of like what rest would look like or what rest should look like, and you called out kind of going on your smartphone as kind of a bad example. Um, what are the components? how would you describe the components of a restful activity versus what we think rest looks like? Or because I mean, so many of us after a hard day of work like to sit down on the couch. Maybe we watch television. Maybe we doom scroll on our phone. It sounds to me that that is not the ideal version of a restful activity. So what can you compare and contrast what we do versus what rest really needs to have?
One of the main things that, one of the main ways that people think they're resting is by going on their smartphones. And the reason your smartphone feels restful is it's not just the dopamine hit that it's giving you, it's the fact that it's a distraction from what you were just doing. So it's
Mhm.
masquerading as rest. You know, when you're sitting at your desk and you're at work, you're performing a work related task that's quite cognitively strenuous, and then you just sneak away for a bit and go on your phone, you're getting that dopamine hit. And as I said, that's masquerading as rest, because really for your brain, all that's doing is training your distraction. It's basically, it's not allowing you to engage in true self-generated thought. So the important thing is to say is it's not activating your default network. It's not activating your resting brain network. So the things that really activate your resting brain network are things that are effortless but also much more natural. So, just staring into space for a few minutes, that's activating your default network. Mind wandering, just letting your mind roam and think up creative different ideas, and just daydreaming essentially. That's really good for your default network activity. Having a 30-minute nap in the day. So amazingly, we now know that people who have a 30-minute nap every day literally have bigger brains than people who don't. And the difference is really significant. We're talking 15 cubic centimeters, which, to put that into context for your listeners, that's the volume of a small plum. And when you think about the cognitive potential, like the millions of neurons and synapses and connections that are contained within the volume of a small plum, it's extraordinary. And so, it's also things, like play as well. So, what when you think about play, you think, okay, what is play? Play is, it's imaginative, it's unstructured, it's open-ended, it's and crucially, it's task off. These are all default network functions. So, those are the things that are restful. You're playing with your kids and your family, just goofing around. That's going to be good for your default network. Sitting on the sofa with a cup of tea and just staring at, your house plants or your cats or the books lining your shelf and just letting your mind wander. That's restful to the brain. And crucially as well, when you're in a green space, I mean, loads of amazing things happen to your brain in your default network when you're in a green space, but that really helps to highlight what rest is to the brain, because when you're in nature, you when you think about nature, it holds your attention in a very effortless way. And so psychologists refer to this as soft fascinations. So these are things in nature like, the rustling of leaves on the trees, the lapping of waves when you're on a beach. They're soft fascinations that hold your attention in a very effortless way. And they're doing that because they're activating your resting brain. And so that is in stark contrast with what we call hard fascinations. So that's things like your phone, LED billboards, train announcements, overbearing bosses, work emails, all of those kind of things. And those things feel effortful and they drain your attentional resources and cause cognitive fatigue. So, it's really, so I suppose those are some of those are the ways to sort of demarcate the rest, the rest from non-rest, I suppose. And screens is like a big part of it, but it's also just overwork. um when we're working, we're using our executive network, which is our work related network. That only occupies about 5 to 10% of the brain, as opposed to 20% for the default network. And interestingly, these networks work in competition with each other. So when you're using one, the other one's quite quiet, and vice versa. And as I say in the book, we're really going in the wrong direction in terms of overwork and burnout. So just to give your listeners some statistics. So globally, overwork now causes 750,000 deaths a year, and that's a 29% increase since 2000. 3 in 5 employees now report a lack of interest, motivation, and energy, which is a 38% increase since 2019. So even though it's true to say, it's undeniable that working conditions are better today than they were in the past, the fact is we are in a dramatic regression in terms of burnout and overwork. There is a reason we hear about it, often in the media in terms of burnout. Um, and so, but really, it's only in the past few years that neuroscientists have started to realize the antidote to that is much more default network activity. It's much more resting brain activity.
I want to stay on this topic of the default mode network because it's something new, even to me as somebody who's, taken neuroscience coursework and do a lot of reading. It's actually really hard to understand this idea. Like, what is the brain actually doing behind the scenes? Could you attempt to kind of walk us through what is actually happening in our brains? From an analogy standpoint, it sounds like, I'm picturing little gnomes walking around organizing papers into folders that during all this rest time. But it's actually I have a hard time picturing what's going on. Could you take a stab at describing what this default mode network is doing when we're at rest?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. So the default network, so anatomically, it's spread out across the brain, but it occupies four main areas. So it starts at the medial prefrontal cortex, which is a region just at the front of your brain behind your forehead. It then goes deep into the middle of the brain into an area we call the posterior cingulate cortex. From the middle of the brain, it then goes up towards the back of the brain to an area we call the precuneus, and then finally back down to an area called the angular gyrus, which is just above your ears on the side of your head. And so essentially, that network of neurons, it becomes active when we rest. And by active, I just mean, it's firing a lot more electrochemical signals. Blood flow is increasing, oxygen is increasing. It's becoming much more, metabolically and physiologically active.
Okay.
And somehow, and this is, an area that's still under very intense research, somehow that activity is allowing us to solve problems in a way that we're just not able to when this network is not active. So if you think about a really good example of this is if you think about when you're sitting down at your desk and you're trying to figure something out, you're trying to, you're working on a really difficult, intractable problem, and you decide you've had enough, and you get up from your desk and you just go for a walk, and the idea just pops into your head whilst you're walking. And psychologists have known about this for a while, and they call it the incubation effect. Yeah, that's your default network, basically subconsciously, busily like working on the problem without you even being aware of it. And exactly how it's solving that problem is a bit of a mystery. It's most likely to do with forming new connections, testing out different scenarios, different ideas, all at a very deep neuromolecular electrophysiological way. But that's essentially what's happening. It's basically, it's for whatever reason, it has the neurobiological hardware to think about these problems in a way that's way more advanced than us sitting down and just trying to grind out the problem by focusing really intently on it.
Yeah, it reminds me of this important distinction between conscious and subconscious processing that we kind of build our view of reality as what we can, touch, smell, see, and hear. But there's so much going on behind the scenes, and it's very easy to forget about because we really don't directly observe it. I love this idea of the incubation effect where there's processing going on. It happened to me recently. I was working on the New York Times connection puzzle where you try to find four categories for these 16 words that you're presented. And I mean, it was just a perfect example. I was working on it for 15 minutes and I hit a wall. I hit a wall and I'm staring and I'm looking and I left and my fiance told me, you know, you're going to go back to it and you're going to see it immediately, with this last two categories. And sure enough, that's it. It's exactly what happened. That there was something, I take out my phone, I look at it, and within 30 seconds, maybe 10 seconds, I could see this cognitive category for these words that I just didn't see when I was putting in effort. And I guess, you know,
Hmm.
how much of this is the absence of effort, right? Is that the definition of these different systems, that the one network is effortful and and this default mode network is effortless or mindless?
Hmm. Yeah, I would say so. It is a distinction between effort and effortless. So, often I get asked the question, is this related to mindfulness meditation? But it's not about a focused attention on the present. It's much more effortless than that. Because when we're using our executive network, our working network, we are cognitively leaning into a task. It feels very effortful. Whereas the default network is active when, we're doing things that feel effortless. So staring into space feels effortless. Sitting on a beach and looking at the waves feels effortless. Having that 30-minute nap feels effortless. Mind wandering feels effortless. So there is that distinction. Um, but it really is extraordinary because, as you were saying a moment ago about, you walked away from your desk and it suddenly popped into your head. A mountain of data now shows that whether you're a student, a train driver, a doctor, like no matter what you're doing, no matter what task you're doing, you'll perform better on that task if you rest beforehand, precisely because you're engaging your brain's default network. I mean, physicists have been shown to solve their equations better when they have a healthy period of rest beforehand. Doctors have been shown to, perform all manner of procedures when they're rested versus doctors who aren't. And it's really, when you look into the history of it, I talk a little bit in the book about this French polymath called Henri Poincaré, and he was an extraordinary man. This is more than 100 years ago now, and he he realized that whenever he left his desk, the solutions to his equations would suddenly pop into his head. So he would deliberately do things like go and sit on a bus with, like, going nowhere in particular, or he'd wander along the beach, or he'd wander in the woods. And at the time, he called it sudden illumination, and he tried to tell people about it. He told, like, other psychologists and scientists at this very big conference, and but he was basically ignored because, science is only ever as good as the techniques at the time, and at the time he was relying on, self-reports and, um, a lot of sort of anecdotal evidence, I suppose. Um, and at the time people were still very wrapped up with Freudian psychology and those sort of interpretations, but we now know that sudden illumination is default network activity. So it's been there for a long time. It's just that we've only recently started to uncover the neuroscience of it. But yeah, it's basically, it's the things that feel, to come back to your original question, that feel effortless. And I think that's a part of the reason that there is initial resistance to it as well, because you have that productivity guilt pushing against it as a part, that's just a leftover from, as we said, like, our cultural and scientific misunderstandings.
We're definitely going to get into some of the specific practices that you talk about in the book, but I want to tackle a couple more maybe arguments that people might be thinking, because I still think this message of you need to rest more. I feel like is not one that people easily swallow, especially people that are really busy. They're gonna the type that says, I just don't have time to relax. There's lots of these little arguments or pushbacks that people might think of when they toy around with this notion of having more rest. One of those relates to how passionate you are about your work. Um, there's this quote that I always think about when it comes to making job decisions, which is you often feel tired, not because you've done too much, but because you've done too little of what sparks a light in you. And it kind of suggests that there's this idea that when you're working for something you really want, it's less exhaustive. Um, could you make the case that
Hmm.
that when you have a passion that that really draws you in, that the need for rest is less important, or do you feel that that's BS, that we still need to activate that default mode network in order to have our best product?
I do think, and I say in the book quite early on, I'm not by any stretch anti-work or anti-ambition or anti-productivity. One of the main arguments I'm making in the book is that rest actually improves your long-term productivity, but we're so obsessed with short-term productivity that we work in these incredibly intense, hustle mentality periods of work, to achieve that short-term productivity, but that harms our long-term productivity. But there is truth to that. Obviously, some people do enjoy working really, really hard, and I certainly wouldn't want to tell people if they're really striving to do things, not to work, hard. Obviously, there are periods of time in your life where you do have to work really hard, like, studying to become a doctor. There are going to be periods of time where you just have to work hard, right? Um, and, I'm also a believer in this idea that sometimes you can feel stressed, not because you're working too hard, but actually because you feel that there are things that you want to achieve and you're just not able to do them. And that actually, sometimes you do need to spend periods of time working quite hard. So I'm certainly not. I wouldn't argue against, um, I wouldn't argue against any of that. But the point I suppose I'm making is that despite that, we still massively undervalue the neurological benefits of rest, and that all those people out there who have that working mentality of I'm just going to work harder and harder and harder. I used to have that, and what I would say to them is that's wonderful, good for you, but bear in mind that actually, even though it might not feel like it, if you actually take rest a bit more seriously and just ease off a little bit and try and weave rest into your day, in whichever way you can, you will find that actually you're being more productive and your memory's improving and your ability to, think creatively and solve problems and communicate more, more fluidly and effectively. Those things will improve. And obviously, I understand that there are different types of work have different demands, and obviously, so, totally understand. Many people would say, there are certain times where I just can't do that, Joe. I just need to grind it out, and yeah, and I understand that, of course. Um, but I just think that you know we s- the main argument I'm making is that we still don't understand how powerful rest is in terms of driving all of our cognitive abilities and abilities to achieve the meaningful, productive things that we want to achieve in our life.
Yeah, and it reminds me of a common misconception about early human ancestors, because and I don't have any hard date on this, but I feel like if I were to ask a whole bunch of my students to describe early human life in tribal life, it's a lot of, they would describe it as very chaotic, a lot of concern about resources, not having enough food, having shelter, fighting animals or fighting other tribes. Like, I suspect they would describe this very chaotic environment. However, we know that our early human ancestors did a ton of resting. They sat a lot, and it was literal, it was likely related to the amount of activity they were doing. Like, they have, I mean, if you think about how lions operate, these apex predators, they're a ton of energy expenditure to kill their food, and then they lay around all day. And I'm curious if you've come across this misconception, if you feel that that most people kind of misinterpret how chaotic the early human environment was, and how that might fit into the rest story.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I haven't come across it personally. I haven't come across it myself. Like the sort of misunderstanding of the early human ancestors in that regard. I mean, I've come across other sort of slight misunderstandings to do with our early human ancestors. I think there was, I mean, I think, I've come across like some people who sort of think that you know, it was all sort of fun and games and full of love and and not really brutal and
I guess that would be the opposite of
and
what
barbaric.
I'm proposing.
Yeah, I've
Yeah.
come across that sort of rose-tinted view of early human life, which I don't think any anthropologist like worth their salt would agree with.
Right.
Um, but in terms of, I mean, yeah, in terms of rest, it's a really interesting one because obviously when you've got that radically different environment, as you said, people are just trying to survive. They're too busy to think about, how many likes they have on their social media page, and they're too busy trying to survive, basically, to think about all of these kind of these modern problems that we have. But um, you know, we obviously live like much more comfortable lives today, but it is a double-edged sword when you think about our digital technology, our social media, our phones, the rise of AI. These things obviously make a lot of our lives a little bit easier, certainly with AI. But then the great irony is that we're just doing more and more and more and more. I think that's why all this of the statistics to do with burnout and overwork are moving in the wrong direction. Because while on the one hand we're moving forward with our technology and our human progress to make certain things of our life much easier, certainly much easier, and certainly even much more possible than our certainly our not just our forebears, but our but our um ancient human ancestors. But it sometimes it's a bit of a trick. We're just doing more as a result, and that's just sort of, obviously I would never like I would never try and encourage us to like move back to that early stage of human development. Um,
Or at least, well,
in
I
you
mean, the value lies within this environment of a small tribe, and discussing the day, this kind of rest where you're maybe
Hmm.
debriefing on the day. It's obviously there are some, I think there's some benefits to this, to our evolutionary past. I think it's a gateway to help us understand what we need as human beings, and I think we overlook that. I don't,
Hmm.
sitting around the fire vibe that we don't really have anymore, and that might have
Yeah,
been very restful.
that's yeah. See, yeah, when you put it like that, there is there is a sort of heritage of rest that we've lost. So you said about sitting around the fire. I think that's really true. I remember, I was chatting, some of the I was chatting with this really interesting psychologist here in the UK, Charles Fernyhough, and he was telling me about his daughter and how, you know, if she's in the garden, um, I think it was what she'll often be like on her iPad or her iPhone, as lots of children are these days. And he was telling me that, when he was growing up, he would just be on the bench staring at the trees, and I think that that's really what we've lost, isn't it? The ability that, I can remember a time when, I was in my, when I was in my teens and early 20s, I was still on a thing like the Nokia 3210, right? And the iPhone wasn't really a thing at that point, or it was just coming into being. And so I could still remember just spending time in the garden staring at the trees rather than just being on a smartphone. So there is a kind of heritage of rest that I think we have lost. And as you said, it comes back to your point about community as well, and about smaller communities. The fact that we're all able to, see each other on social media all around the world, obviously that comes with benefits, but it does affect our ability to rest as well. It affects our ability to live as a community, to live with each other, and just appreciate what we have, and the restful environments that we have. But especially because we're all really anxious now, because we're constantly checking the news on our smartphone. We're constantly thinking about things that are happening, you know, far, far away. And obviously It's in that's good in some respects. Again, I'm not anti-progress. I think that kind of globalization and that kind of widening of our moral social circle, if you will, does come with many benefits, but it also does come at the cost of not just our mental health, but our ability to rest.
You talk about lots of different practices. You highlight some ideas that are really, really helpful, really enriching versions of rest. I want to take a deep dive into a couple of these. Let's start with just this basic idea of mind wandering. Um, what is mind wandering? What do we need to know about mind wandering if there are benefits? And also, is there a difference between uh, mind wandering and just plain old doing nothing? Like, what is there something neuroscientifically speaking going on when we're mind wandering versus sitting on the couch doing nothing?
So, I suppose the first thing to say is that when you spend time doing nothing, just sitting on the couch, you will often just mind wander as a result of that activity, because mind wandering is something that we actually do between 25 and 50% of our waking day. So we spend an awful lot of our time mind wandering. And as I said before, we because of our misunderstanding of rest, and we were taught as children, don't daydream, don't stare out the window and daydream, that's bad for you, snap back into attention and focus. And so we think of it quite negatively. But mind wandering, it's so obviously such a crucial brain function that we need to explore more. There's a reason we spend so much of our waking lives doing it. And the neuroscience behind it is really interesting. So we think it's to do mostly with creativity, with basically testing out different ideas. Because essentially when you mind wander, your brain is essentially performing a kind of mental filtering process. It's and this is part of the reason when you often mind wander when you're working on a boring task. It's your brain's way of assessing the situation and thinking, actually, is there something more enriching and enlightening and creative that I could be thinking about? And so it sort of is performing a kind of scan, if you like, and it's testing out ideas. And it's it, you know it's really interesting because mind wandering is even if you're mind wandering to the point where you actually hinder your ability on a task. So if you're trying to work and you start daydreaming, your mind's wandering, and then you say, actually, no, I read in Joe Jebelli's book that this is good for my default network and my resting brain. So actually, I'm going to indulge this. And then you do it for a bit too long, and your performance on the task in front of you is hindered as a result. Even then, the science shows your creativity is still enhanced overall. It's enhanced in the here and the now, and it's enhanced in the long run. So, we massively underestimate the power of mind wandering for creativity. And so it's something that we know it's a really it's something that has a very potent effect in terms of activating the default network, but it's also something that it is so strongly linked to creativity now that we need to spend much more of our time with in intentionally mind wandering wherever we can. I for the book I there was this I spent quite a bit of time, a few months, with this really fascinating psychologist in the States, actually, called Russell Hurlburt. And he has this really interesting way of studying mind wandering and people's experiential perspectives on the world. He basically uses this technique called descriptive experience sampling, or DES, and you basically get given a beeper and told to just go out and do your daily tasks and live your life as you would, and it beeps randomly throughout the day. And whenever it beeps, you're supposed to write down like what you were thinking about, or your experience at the time. Now, obviously, there are going to be times when, I don't know, you might be on the toilet or something and you don't want to basically talk about that beep, and you can ignore those, and that's fine. But the really interesting thing about what Russell is doing there is that he's studying mind wandering in the wild, so to speak, out of the laboratory, because mind wandering by definition is a very hard thing to study in the laboratory, because so many of the conditions in the laboratory are going to affect the science itself. And I spent a few months doing this with Russell and his team of psychologists. And one of the things I discovered was that we do have like a very rich inner world that we need to explore much more, that we need to take seriously. And we can only take that seriously by getting off of our phones and actually exploring our wandering minds more. One of my favorite studies is when I think it was between Japan and the UK, and they asked a group of students to basically sit in a room and just think for like half an hour. They weren't allowed their phones, they weren't allowed any other distractions. They had to just think. And they asked the students before the experiment, how do you think this is going to go? Do you think you're going to enjoy it? What do you think? What do you expect to be your the outcome of this study? And they basically all had really negative, as you would expect, negative views of it. They thought it'd be really boring. They thought it would be like quite painful and just they would just sit there and wait for it to be over. But they all came out like unbelievably overwhelmed by how enriching and surprising and enlightening it was, because they, just being alone with their thoughts, being allowed to mind wander and have that inner self-generated thought, which is now sadly, I think, becoming almost an endangered species,
Yeah.
given how much we're on our phones and how much we're trying to conform to whatever this influencer or this political ideologue or that person is thinking. We're losing that ability. We're losing our sense of self even. So, that's one of the things, that's one of the reasons why I encourage people to mind wander, to actually have their own self-generated internal roaming thoughts, because it's really good for your brain. It's also really good for your sense of self.
So for people that might listen to this and have this strong reaction of I really find it uncomfortable to be alone with my thoughts. Like this idea of silence and sitting sounds pretty scary. I know a lot of people suffer from rumination, right? If they attempt to mind wander, they can't. They end up going down these rabbit holes of thought, and it maybe makes them even more anxious. So, what would you say to that to those types of individuals?
So the field of mind wandering, it's really interesting. It's sort of split between all of the positive effects of mind wandering, but then also the some of the negative effects of mind wandering, like you said, rumination, which in people who are suffering from depression is obviously really quite detrimental to their mental health. And I've been asked about this before, and what I would say is, if you're mind wandering and you start ruminating and feeling depressed, then just stop. Just stop mind wandering and go and do something else. Go and find another form of rest. Find a form of active rest, for instance, which is what I often do, where I go for a run for 30 minutes, which is also really good for your default network and your brain. Or do it, engage in a task that's creative but doesn't require much effort. Things like knitting or like pottery, or things that are still relaxing and creative, or even things like reading a fiction book. That's a task, but because it's sparking your imagination, you're still engaging your default network. So I would say, if you get to that point with mind wandering, then just stop mind wandering and perform. Try and find some other restful activity. But I wouldn't want to discourage those people from still engaging with mind wandering when it feels, healthy and acceptable for them to do so.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned the something to occupy the hands. S- it when you kind of couch it as do something to occupy, the crocheting. I like to flip through playing cards. You actually do experience this split. It's not, I mean, it feels like a split in consciousness, that something is being
Mm.
occupied, something's being fed while I'm doing this mindless activity, that it feels like it's a little freeing. It feels like it opens doors. And I've heard lots of people talk about this. That's why they have fidget spinners and things like that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's because it's relaxing, right? Like you're even though you're performing a task that's is not very cognitively exerting, and it's something that you enjoy, crucially, and you find that relaxing. But at the same time, you're actually able to to focus a little bit and almost lose yourself in that task. Um, and that's in a straight in a way it's its own kind of mind wandering because you're locked in on a task, but you're it's freeing your mind to form other connections to think of different things. And it's a great way of I suppose it's a great way of using distraction in a really healthy way, I would say.
Mhm.
It's not a phone, it's not the artificial light of a phone, which is really bad for you. It's something that is quite soothing and is much healthier. Again, it's still a task, so I would still encourage people to spend time genuinely just doing nothing, genuinely just sitting in the garden and staring at the clouds. Um, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, I talk a little bit in the book about things like pottery and going for runs and knitting, um, and all these other sort of like little tasks you can do that are very restful to the brain.
You mentioned exercise as being a form of rest, which I'm sure on the surface might seem counterintuitive. Obviously, you explained it in detail. Um, in order to, in order for physical activity to be classified as rest, does it have to be one of those types of exercises that requires minimal thinking, like a jog? Are there different types of exercises that you wouldn't recommend in terms of of engaging in for the sake of rest?
So it's really interesting because the the studies looking into this have found that exercise in general, so like anything like aerobic exercise and even weightlifting, is good for your brain overall. Like, it's very, anything that's good for your heart health, for instance, is going to be really good for your brain health. I mean, so many people with dementia or some other form of neurodegenerative disease are often post-mortem found with some kind of heart problem as well. So we know that exercise is good for the brain in general. But interestingly, it's the gentle exercises that are actually seem to have quite a really surprisingly big impact on brain health. They did a very large study in the States a few years ago where they showed that 25 minutes of gentle exercise a week, so that's like 4 minutes of gentle exercise a day, was enough to grow a bigger brain. And so we think it's to do with what we call BDNF, a brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is basically a molecule that is released in your brain, and it kind of acts like a fertilizer on a garden. It sprouts new nerve cells, new synapses, new connections. It's really, really beneficial for your brain. People are even studying BDNF in terms of like slowing the progression of Alzheimer's disease. That's how powerful that's how powerful this molecule is in terms of keeping your brain cells healthy and thriving. Um, so I suppose so. The point, I have the chapter called "Active Rest" because many of the people I spoke to for the book said, I find going for a run restful, and I'm the same. Like if I go for like a 30-minute run, I come back and I feel rested. I feel like I've decompressed. Lots of the stresses and worries of the day have sort of have evaporated, and that's also to do with things like there's a molecule called myokines, and they're released from your muscles, and they are one of the few molecules that actually cross the blood-brain barrier and act as an antidepressant. And so they're released from the muscles when you walk and when you run, when you perform any sort of like exercise. And so that, the reason that you feel less anxious and your mood lifts, these are real neurophysiological things happening. And that's why you then come away also feeling more rested because you feel less stressed, less anxious, less depressed, a bit better about things. And so I would encourage people, to engage in conventional exercise, that the aerobic and the weightlifting and all that stuff that we know is good for the body and the brain, but also to think about, also to think about lighter, gentler exercises, which, it might not feel like you're doing very much, just going for a little walk or something, or doing some stretches or some yoga or some Tai Chi. But even those things actually really have a profound effect on your brain.
So to close, I want to talk about this idea that you devote a chapter to called Nixon, which more or less is planned doing nothing. But it's a cultural phenomenon that we don't have here in the U.S. And I like this chapter because as in my course, I talk about the value of play quite a bit. You mentioned play earlier, and the conversation tends to center around not the benefits of play, but that you have to schedule it. It has to be something that you commit to, because people acknowledge that they have activities that bring them joy, but they don't always build it into their schedule because it just happens. And I think one of my takeaways from that chapter on Nixon is that you got to make an effort to plan blocks of time for these types of activities. So could you just describe what Nixon is, and how, listeners that are trying to figure out how to do this, how they can incorporate some of this philosophy into their everyday life?
So Nixon it's a Dutch concept. The word literally just means to do nothing. It means nothing-ing. It's actually like a verb, to do nothing.
Yeah, that's I
Nothing-ing.
was trying to describe plan to doing nothing, or plan to nothingness. It's a tough verb to describe. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's a really interesting one because for that chapter, I spoke to Olga Mecking, really interesting writer who, she published a book on Nixon and all of the different ways that you can nix, as they refer to it. And it really is, as you said, about being much more intentional about doing nothing, about rest. It's about creating a cultural philosophy around rest. It's about saying, okay, I'm gonna sit on the sofa, I'm gonna have a cup of tea, and I'm just gonna stare at the plants and the books on my shelf. It's about basically doing it like, engaging in rest guilt free, basically. It's about, I mean, Olga had a wonderful way of putting it when I spoke to her. She said it's about finding the moments in between things, all those little pockets of time, those few minutes here or there where you could actually just spend some time thinking, actually, I'm going to be intentionally restful in the next 5 minutes. I've got this little pocket of 5 minutes. I'm just going to sit down and relax and just do nothing. And I'm not going to feel guilty about it. I'm not going to feel like I'm wasting my time. It's not going to feel unprincipled because, it's not, and it's really good for your brain. And so I think we do need to be much more intentional about our rest. And I ended with that in the book because I just really like this idea that there is a cultural kind of national philosophy around rest, and just taking it a lot more seriously. And I think if we can sort of incorporate some of that all-embracing philosophy, here in England and also certainly in America, yeah, I definitely welcome it.
Well, yeah, it definitely inspired me to try to figure out ways to schedule time to do nothing. If you're listening to this episode, take 5 to 10 minutes as soon as it's over, and just stare out into space as a little experiment to see if it's something that might work for you. Thank you so much for being on today. I really appreciate it. Again, the name of the book is The Brain at Rest: How the Art and Science of Doing Nothing Can Improve Your Life. Thank you so much, Joseph Jebelli.
Thank you, Ryan.
For more on Joseph, pick up a copy of The Brain at Rest: How the Art and Science of Doing Nothing Can Improve Your Life, wherever books are sold. For more on the topic of rest, check out episode 39, Boredom, with Aaron Westgate, and episode 63, Solitude, with Twee V. Win. If you enjoy this podcast, please share an episode with two of your friends. Head over to patreon.com/whydowethatpodcast to become a paid supporter of the show. You'll gain early access to episodes as well as bonus video content. Follow on Instagram or Facebook at Why Do We Do That Podcast, or on X at WDWDTPod. Until next time, this is Dr. Ryan Moyer, hoping you found some answers to the question, why do we do that?